Bit of a rapid fire. I actually have intentionally not looked at any of these photos, or most of them anyways, except for the ones that found its way into the committee whittle. And I'll just give a brief knowledge bomb. Not even a knowledge bomb, just like a knowledge, water balloon, let's say. Let's start off with Diane. This is a very cool shot that definitely resonated with the committee as well. I think it's really clever how you shot this. We have a single subject that's more lit than the rest of the frame, which is generally what you want. You want the brightest part of the image to be your main subject. I don't know if I see the child as the main subject if I were just shooting this, perhaps because these folks over here, they look very interesting, with their their sleeves, their tattoo sleeves, and their interesting hats. They just look like interesting characters that I would want to see. And everyone that's not well lit is actually very much in the shadows. Perhaps that is some post-processing work, because even the side of the face that would be in the light is very much darkened and dampened. So I get the effect that you were going for, but it leaves me wanting to see more. I don't know, maybe if you had just raised the shadows just a tad or not darken them as much, it would create a little bit more balance here. Also a little bit rough on the clarity slider, the contrast, which is okay, especially for black and white processing. But I should say it is a little bit on the extreme end of the clarity slider, just so you know, not necessarily that it's wrong. But definitely very, very interesting documentation type of street photography shot here. That would be my critique. I think I would just want to see these figures a little bit more. You can have your brightest part or your main subject be the brightest part of the image. Doesn't mean you have to completely darken out the rest. It could be a little bit more subtle, or even like I've shown you in previous screencasts, not darkening the exposure, meaning the overall exposure, but just darkening certain aspects of the rest of the frame, like just the highlights or just the shadows. Okay, Caroline, welcome back. I think this is a similar critique that I would have. I feel look, you have to expose for the sky here because that's what caught your eye, it seems. Hold on, new version of bridge. What's going on here? Oh boy. Please hold. Okay, and we're back. Thank you, Adobe, for that wonderful introduction to the new version of bridge that I just installed. So you can lift the shadows here, which you'll see will just raise the bottom portion because this photo is very much divided. You have highlights at the top and shadows at the bottom, or you could take a brush and you can raise the shadows, you can raise the exposure, you can, get a little bit. Okay, so this is an extreme processing that I just did, but it seems like we could see a bit more. I would maybe dampen it by 50%. I don't think that was 50%. That was 100%. Let's just bring this down by 50%, something like that. So it could still be subtle. The sky is still going to be nicely exposed. We're looking at the sky because it's the brightest portion of the image, but we're seeing a little bit more of our shadowy foreground. Okay. What do we got here? Beth. So without looking too deeply, again, this is just my gut reaction. I'm seeing these for the first time. I have a little bit of a opposite, if you will, critique from Diane's photo. Well, not an opposite critique, but whereas in Diane's photo, we're clearly seeing only one subject. And I said, well, I would like to see a little bit more. Here we're seeing everyone well balanced and evenly lit or similarly lit. But I don't see one item. I'm not drawn, the eye's not drawn to one subject or one theme. I don't even know exactly what I'm looking at. These people are cropped out here. So in terms of framing, you really need to first choose, what is my main subject? What do I want to show? And to cut off a group of people or a sign, there's just a lot of different shapes and characters that are all over the place, that are not really balanced in the frame where my eye can focus on one thing. I'll just skip Barb for the moment, just to on that thought. I mean, here, despite some other flaws potentially, the framing is really nice here. Carol decided that this guy, this drummer, is going to be the main subject of the frame and made sure to have nice even space around the subject. Also some nice contrast, kind of the opposite. Everything is well lit except for him. He's a bit darker than the rest, maybe because of his sweatshirt. But he stands out nonetheless, and it's very clear he is the main subject. Here, it just doesn't stand out what is the main. I'll have to start looking at it and zooming in and saying, okay, human rights, they're walking, it's a protest. Perhaps this is Washington, D.C. You know, it's fine. Like, we could piece it together. But I don't think that that is not on the viewer to try and piece together your photo. Your photo should be pretty clear what it's showing right off the bat. Okay, so let's go back to Barb here. This is a beautiful example of what's called natural framing. I talk about this in my 101 course in the chapter called Mind Your Foreground. And this is really a beautiful way of framing a shot, especially a really nice candid street photography moment, such as this. Really nicely done. Carol, if I could critique some technical, it doesn't look like, I feel like you shot this with your phone. So perhaps you're on the road. You usually shoot with a DSLR type, and I'm not seeing anything actually, but it does look mobile-like. The quality here is a little bit muddled. It could be a low shutter speed of your phone, and he's clearly moving. And also, although you've exposed for him, I think fairly well, everything else is blown out. So your exposure is a bit too hot all around. You could have maybe balanced that out in post. Not as easy if you're shooting with a mobile. Duncan, you know, so it's interesting. There's nothing cut off. No main subject cut off. There's nothing I can't see. It's actually pretty orderly. However, you still have, let's say this guy would be the main subject. So he's not exactly in focus. So that would be, your main subject needs to be generally more lit than the rest of the frame and the most in focus, at the very least in focus. So that would be the first critique. But we have a woman right behind him. Okay, again, I understand this is street photography. It's reality. You're not going to ask people to pose and hide and jump under the table. I'm just telling you what is. This is what is in the frame. So this is what I'm seeing. These are distractions to the eye, whether you could have changed it or not. We have a piece of a woman, what looks like a woman here behind him. Got an arm, a little bit of a leg, some pieces. We have another piece of a man, some bigger pieces. Got most of an upper torso and most of his two legs. And then we have what looks like smaller humanoids back here and some wheel device and a half a truck. So what am I trying to say here? Let's say you decided what the main subject is, which in this case I'd have to imagine is this bloke with the blue coat. The bloke with the blue coat. So how could you isolate him so that we don't have any other pieces of people in the frame? Well, you could have taken a tiny step to your right. And that would have placed all of these other non-essential humanoids behind him, hidden away from view, or at least mostly hidden away from view. And you could have really grabbed focus on this subject. And I think that would have lend itself to a frame where the viewer doesn't have to guess, where the viewer immediately sees, okay, that's the main subject. Because I'm not exactly sure what the main subject is. There's a lot of things going on. Maybe that will be the theme of, there's always a theme that comes up from these screencasts. Maybe that's the one. Dawn, this is just so nice. And I did not even realize that you won. Not won. There's no winnings, not a contest, but you were chosen as a top 3 honor in our last album, or was it 2 albums ago, that you were the cover photo. So that's pretty rare. I mean, I guess you're doing something right. Keep taking those photography pills in the morning. But this is just a beautiful coalescence of story creativity and technique. You have these main subjects here perfectly in focus, beautiful space around, despite being very difficult conditions to shoot in bright snow. I just paused here because I realized last week I actually went through the album because you could see the EXIF here, and then I popped back to Adobe Bridge if I needed to. Hold on, my mouse just died. That actually sounds pretty funny. No mice were injured in this screencast. So yeah, actually, Carol, I don't know if you wiped your EXIF. I'm still working on keeping the EXIF through our compression. So I'm actually not only able to see the EXIF now on the website. Dawn actually did not leave her EXIF here, but Carol, I just glanced at your EXIF data and your shutter was 1/60, so a little bit slow for this action. So back to Dawn. I guess we'll switch to the website because then I could also read these nice little captions. But yeah, I mean, just a beautiful shot, really nicely framed. I love the bit of backstory here. You really took advantage of a situation here. And yeah, I mean, it's very clear what the main subject is here, right? In terms of, the last thing that we just critiqued in terms of distraction, there is no distraction here. There's zero distraction, and that is by design. So really nicely done and a beautiful story to boot. Okay, Kim. Look who I found on the escalator. Mall Santa and his elf. Okay. So, okay, so here's some things I like about this photo. It's difficult lighting when you're shooting indoors, especially a mall type setting. Your reds are a little bit too saturated, but I do think it's a very cute shot. And what I do like about it is, everything that I've just been talking about, I think this is done right. So we have nothing really cropped out, nothing majorly cropped out of the frame. It's very clear who our main subject is, even though a tad too saturated. And we have some nice leading lines and symmetry that are bringing our eye right to the main subject. I mean, that's what you want to do, folks. It's pretty easy. You just want to lead the viewer's eyes to the main subject. I mean, that's kind of what you always want to do. And you know it when you see it. When you see these photos that just have a very clear main subject. We'll throw in this one too. Just glance at all of these. It doesn't, you don't have to think about it too much. As opposed to, and I'm not saying right or wrong here, but as opposed to different kinds of shots where there's a lot going on, okay? If you just glance at these shots real quick, you can't really pull out, this is obviously a woman or a car or a tree or something. There's a lot going on here. And again, it's not right or wrong, but when you have a lot going on, you need to try and quiet the clutter somewhat, which I go through extensively in my 101 course, clearing the clutter. So, you could do that through the use of light or focus, and I think those are the elements of a good photograph. So let's see if we can continue going so out of order here. So Kim, I think that's done right. Those two gentlemen over there are not cut off. Tammy, this I brought up as an example of a little bit cluttered. So we're seeing a whole lot of everything. We also cropping off this gentleman's or this person's knees, which is a pretty big no-no. You don't want to crop at the joint. And again, it's it's data that we can't see. So I understand it was intentional to have the blur here, but I maybe would have doubled up on this subject here. Excuse me. I would have waited until they, they were the only ones in the frame, let's say, and I would have maybe tried to keep focus on them exclusively. So F8. Don't think that was so necessary. And perhaps, you're on a tripod here. You're on 4 seconds. You could have maybe done a wider aperture so that you can play with that focus so it's a little bit less, all over the place in terms of where the eye is looking. Okay, so we have Sarah here. It is actually a very similar shot to Tammy. And let me bring this up here in Bridge. Now I need to find it. No, don't purge cache. Open. Okay, I just wanted to point out here, first of all, is the white balance is very yellow to me right off the bat. So, I mean, I don't know if this is pure white, but I'll just choose it just to give you a little bit of a counter look. Don't know if we have any like actual white that we can use here. Maybe this clock was white. That looks even more yellow. I don't think it was this color, but probably somewhere in the middle. So that's first of all. We can go back to our site. Whoops. Second of all, I have a similar critique, and perhaps this is what's bothering me, especially with a slow shutter speed. You really want to have the constant, the things that don't move, i.e. the entire scene here in front of us, to be very clear and nicely framed. Perhaps another way you could have shot this is a little bit wider or perhaps a little bit more centered, and we see the whole scene in front of us, all the buildings nice and clear and sharp and well lit, and then you have your moving components, your moving people in the middle of the frame, in the middle lane perhaps, or just either on both sides of the frame, but surrounded, kind of encapsulated by the static buildings that contain it. I know I could probably go and search for an example that would maybe bring my point more home, but simply put, it seems a little bit distracting, and it may be intentional, and again, not necessarily right or wrong, but the viewer's eye here is kind of darting all over the place. We kind of don't exactly know where we're looking. You do have some nice leading lines here, but it's not super obvious. And these are relatively harsh critiques that I'm giving here because these are great photos, and these aren't just very obviously flawed, let's say. So I'm giving a bit of more of a high level, more advanced critique here of how to go about framing and containing what your subject material is. And the distraction here is that the people walking are kind of without pattern, right? This person is here in the corner, and then we have a couple of staggered things going on elsewhere in the frame. If there is a way to create a bit more symmetry or to create a bit more constant, like I said, with the immovable objects, then it would be more balancing and pleasing to the eye, in my opinion. Okay, so Caroline we covered. Barb we covered. Really nice framing. All right. Jane. All right, let me take a look at this. It's a very cute photo. I'm not sure that this would be street photography unless you were making a little bit of a joke that there is kind of a street in the frame. Generally, street photography is people photography, getting people on the street, getting people in their natural environs, even if it's a small child and a horse. So I think that would be my main critique for that. Okay, Lainey, this is actually a good example of everything that I'm talking about here. This is, or would be, a cluttered scene, right? You have what is clearly your main subject here, but you also have a cart back here and a building, and this guy is right over his shoulder, and you have some other folks back here. And what you did was, I dare say, in a very natural way that almost doesn't look like post, although I'd have to imagine this is post. You took him out. You took the distractions out of the picture, something that I touched on a little bit earlier, using exposure, using contrast, shadows, and light, again, which I go into extensively in my one-on-one course. Not an ad. I'm just saying it is. I'm just stating the facts. The point is that you did your best to quell the distractions. So we see very clearly as the viewer, who is the main subject here? What is the thing that is most in focus? What is the brightest part of the image? And we're drawn to this character, and his environs are now supporting that. They're not getting in the way. I think it's a very good example of a distracting photo that is not distracting. Now, if I were hard-pressed to give a critique, I dare say, you could have avoided that, or at least try to avoid that altogether. I understand the fix, and I think you did it quite well and naturally, but ideally, you don't want anyone in the background. So perhaps you could have changed your angle. Perhaps you could have gotten it lit in this certain way naturally, but I think this subject is really nicely lit. I think you did the best with what you had there, and I think it's a really good example to exactly what we're talking about, is this clutter. So this is interesting. So here, the clutter isn't, I'm switching to, go back here, going back and forth. We'll come back to you. Okay, Susan. Now I'm just getting distracting myself. I'm going to go back to bridge, and then we're going to cut back. I'm going to cut back to the site if we need. This is Patricia. So the clutter here, the throngs of people and things in the frame, it doesn't bother me like it does for some of the other frames. We don't have to bring it up. Because things aren't obviously cut off. Especially we have our lower frame here. It's not cutting off this table from this vendor over here. Our left frame is not cutting off the lights. Top frame is cutting off some buildings, but it seems like this is the main part is well lit here. And again, on the right side, we have this balcony. It's nicely framed so that it's not uncomfortable. And there is some pattern here. If you see my mouse, like I'm drawing, your eye is definitely drawn to this triangle of light here and this brighter portion down here. And I think you did a good job at that. With that said, I do think there's something a little bit awkward or unsettling about the angle. I think if you were just standing right here at this table, it would have been better. I just feel like I want to see more. I want to see more out. I want to get lower. I think you're a bit too high. Perhaps you could have been, completely high, shooting from above and then shooting straight down, or the opposite. But this is kind of in the middle where you're a little bit higher and you're not shooting straight down, but you're definitely shooting at a pretty extreme down angle. And to me, it just feels like some of that is cut off. So I think it's definitely an improvement in terms of, let's call it frame organization. Maybe that would be the theme of this screencast. Frame organization. How to organize all the elements in your frame so that it's not distracting to the viewer's eye. That would be the byline. But yeah, perhaps lower would be a little bit better. Perhaps not. I do think it's a good example of, quelling the clutter, keeping the clutter at bay. So this too is a beautiful example of keeping your main subject clear. Like it's clear who our main subject is. And this is going the opposite approach. So it's not the brightest part of the image, which I always say. It could also be the darkest part of the image, or in this case, a very clear silhouette. And I think, it bugs me a little bit that this tree is cut off, but I think it works. I think it's all intentional. I think it's a really nice way of capturing some clean subject material. Nat. Okay, Sarah, we did. Susan. So Susan, I think you went a little bit hard on the contrast, which is fine for black and white, but we're actually losing some detail on the horse, which is, I think, what would be your main subject here. So you got to be careful with black and white. I think you can raise the midtone contrast, which is known as the clarity slider. I don't think we'll be able to save the exposure here. It's just too baked in. But there's data here in the horse that I think is important that's just getting lost because you were a bit too aggressive on the shadow slider. Also, You didn't crop any of your main subject here, which I assume is the horse and these people on the carriage. But there's a lot cropped in the image. First of all, there's a person here behind the horse. That's a bit distracting because we either want to see them or we don't want to see them at all. And you have two parked cars here that are completely cropped. So again, it's fine. I understand this is a moment in time. This is reality. You're on the street. You can't start asking whose car is this. Can you move back a little bit? But it's just something to keep in mind when looking at your frame. It's just what is, right? It's what is in the frame. It is what I see. And let me add that this aspect of the photo bleeds into the background, meaning the wheels are very dark. This seat on the carriage is very dark, and the background, which is this, wheelbase or whatever it's called, the underside of the car, of the Jeep. I mean, it blends in so much that if I zoomed in, and this is part of crushing your shadows, you can't even really see the difference between the horse's leg and the car behind it, especially if you squint your eyes. What that does in the general picture is it kind of muddies the material. So you can't, the viewer's eyes are not drawn directly and clearly in a very clean and cohesive way to the main subject. So you want to also keep in mind to keep the background contrasted in a way where it's either brighter so that your darker foreground or darker main subject can pop out, or the opposite. Go buy my course, and there's a whole chapter on that as well. All right. Jane. What are these? Oh, cool. Food banks. Wow. That is very cool. So I like how you have this space here on the right side. And I like how that's not cropped off. But I do feel like I want to see beyond here. I feel like it's a bit cropped there to my eye, meaning to the story. My brain wants to see more. So perhaps you could have angled a little bit to the left and maybe taken a little bit small step to your right. Would have seen a little bit more. Okay. Shell. I think this is a good example of keeping space. I like how you have space here on the bottom and left part of the sign. You're not cutting off anyone here. I think this is a good natural frame. That when you hold your camera up to your eye, look at your edges, right? Look at what you're cropping out. So you are cropping out some things. There's a car and there's a sign. I think you did your best. Not so important. If you would have cropped out this sign, well, I can't really show you that unless I if it was like this, okay, so then immediately I'm going to start critiquing, oh wait, I can't see like what's in the foreground here. What is this element? What's that person cropped off there? So I think it's a good starting point. You know, these are things to really think about. As soon as the camera goes to the eye, where do you want your outer frame to be? Oh, and Tammy got you already. So we got some time. That was actually, I feel like that was somehow quicker than usual. Let me drop in some of the non-bonus peeps and see if I have some things to say about it. I think this is just keeping on our, I feel like I know that guy. Who is that guy? Is that Bob? I'm joking. Keeping on our theme, I think this is really nicely framed. We know who the main subject is. He's a bit contrasted with the background. There's some nice space around him. No other distractions in the frame. I think that's a really nice example of kind of everything we were talking about, aside from some other flaws of exposure. Let's continue. So I think this is good all around, except I would want to see a bit more space under his foot. I know I'm annoying, but I call it head space, even though it's foot space. Again, another chapter in my course. I'm sorry. It is. It is a chapter in my course. What am I? I shouldn't say it. You want me to lie? You want me to say it's not in my course? I should have mentioned my course. You know, I'm only trying to help here. But I do like how it's very clear that this is our main subject. I think mostly by way of focus, right? Everything else is blurry, which is a really nice effect. And aside from the foot, it's really nice placement of your subject. Nice. I really like using the foreground elements to blur that out. I think that's very creative. And this is a bit fuzzy. Looks like it was shot with a phone perhaps, but I think it's actually quite good framing based on what we're talking about. Let's see. So here, this is an example of cutting off at a limb at the knees. You generally want to avoid. Now, I would have to imagine that you're going for the house, right? Going for this building, this free house building. And I'm sure she's holding up a book that has that same building. And maybe there's a story there. Maybe she's the author. I get it. But you are cutting off her legs. So perhaps you could have taken a step back so that you don't crop off the body, because it is a bit unnerving to the viewer. You know, this isn't as bad because it's just a little bit of a closer portrait. But here we have the whole body, but just, you know, cut off at the knees. It's kind of a photography no-no. So this is pretty good framing, actually. You got just got all the feet. But there are some distracting people in the background. Again, not much you could do about it. I'm just pointing it out. Okay. I think this is a good example of the opposite of, you know, the proper exposure, let's say, for popping out your subject. Like if your main subject was the woman playing piano, which I would have to assume that's what your main subject is. We want to see it. We want it to be the brightest part of the image. I'm sure I won't be able to do anything with this JPEG because it's pretty crunchy as it is. But okay, I have a brush that's already raising exposure. Let's raise this exposure by like a stupid amount so we totally see it. And then we'll create a new brush. And I mean, this is just going to be a muddy gray, but maybe it'll bring my point home. We're going to just lower the exposure by a stupid amount. Okay. So let's say this was the photo, right? The eye is drawn right away to the foreground, our main subject, our woman playing the piano, the brightest part of the image. If I go to the before, your eye actually darts to the top right part of the frame, comes back to the bottom left part of the frame, goes back to the right part. Your eye will follow the brightest part of the image. So this is actually exposed the opposite of how you want it. So what could you have done? Well, you could have exposed for the shadows. Now, by doing that, everything will be overexposed, right? If you expose for her, everything will be overexposed. So yeah, you got to kind of choose your poison. Or you try and find a subject that is not in the shadow, but rather that they're in the light, that everything else is in the shadow. Perhaps you could have stood over here and shot this way. Maybe there was a darker element just behind you that would have created a good amount of contrast to pop her as a, more exposed foreground / subject with a darker background. Are you still with me? You guys paying attention? So those are different ways to do it. Or you take multiple exposures, and you bring those 5 photos into Photoshop and have fun. Corey, so this is interesting, right? This undoubtedly is quite cluttered. Corey, I remember seeing a different photo from you. Okay, I'll do some research on that. This is objectively quite cluttered, right? But you've shot it in a way where the frame has a lot of negative space. And I think you intentionally cropped in a way that it's pleasing to the eye. I'm not darting everywhere trying to find the subject. I think it's an interesting geometric pattern that's happening in a certain portion of the frame. It's a very interesting way of making something cluttered seem more organized. Okay. These guys, I would want to see a little bit more environment. I'm seeing these guys, but again, you kind of cut them off at the waist, and where are they? What are they doing? Are they waiting online? Is he taking a photo of something? So I understand you got the shot, not an easy thing to do. I have total sweaty palms whenever I come upon this challenge. And I was not as successful as you in getting some actual interest. But that's something to think about. Alrighty. So, we managed to touch on a couple of the regular $5 tier peeps. And I think I'm going to make this public to everyone to watch. I think it's just a nice little observation on street photography, but more importantly on how to frame, right? When you put the camera to your eye, how you need to think, is this super obvious to the viewer? Am I creating my main subject as the brightest portion of the image? Are they the most in focus? Is there any distraction behind them? Is there any distraction elsewhere in the scene? Is there a way I can frame and recompose so that it's the least distracting frame possible? These are all the things you need to be asking yourself before you shoot. And I mean, that ultimately is what will create a more clean frame and an easier to understand photograph, which will ultimately be more powerful and more engaging to the viewer. All right, I hope you guys appreciated that screencast. You guys really kicked butt on this street photography challenge. Definitely did better than me. That's going to be it for this week. Thank you so much to all those who have contributed and continue to contribute. It is immensely needed, appreciated, and I can't thank you enough. It really means everything, and we would not be here without all those that contribute. So if you were thinking of maybe upping your pledge or becoming a new patron, know that your contribution goes directly into the project and really, really helps a lot. So that's going to do it for this week. I'll see you guys next week. In the meantime, happy shooting.